You want to start soon? Okay. It's weird because I can't see the slides on my screen. I can only see them up there. Well, hello. My name is Jay Radcliffe. I am a senior security consultant for Rapid7 and a researcher there. I'm also a ham radio operator and have been since I was a child. And as I've talked to people in our industry and in my travels, I've found out that a lot of the things that I know and a lot of the experience that I got in ham radio has brought me a lot of success in the information security field. And as I've talked about this with people, they've said, you know, that would make a really good talk at a conference. And I was like, yeah, maybe. You know, I can't see talking about ham radio at an information security conference. But I proposed the topic at DerbyCon, and it got accepted. And I got a lot of great positive feedback about how unique of a talk it was and how interesting it was to hear about ham radio and how it relates to information security and some of the things that we do on a regular basis in that field. So, in the light of that, I thought I would give the talk again here, in my hometown. I grew up in the Detroit area, went to school at Wayne State University, and spent the first 31 years of my life here. So this talk is going to be about my experience over the last plus 25 years in ham radio and how it kind of relates to the information security field. I guess the first thing that we need to address, though, is what exactly is ham radio? Is it when we eat ham sandwiches and get on the radio and figure out what we're doing? Not quite. Basically, boiled down, ham radio is a hobby that allows different people from all over the world to use wireless communication to talk to each other and communicate in different ways. And this has been going on since radio began with Tesla and with Marconi about communicating over the ocean. And since then, we've had a very proud and long history of building radios and using radios to communicate over very long distances, or even some short distances. How did I get started in ham radio? Well, really, it begins with this guy, my dad. My dad did a lot of ham radio operating, and he did a lot of electronic stuff. And ever since I can remember, he has been building things and soldering things together and doing hardware and radio stuff. And he's even here today in the back of the room in the blue shirt there. And he has been a wonderful supporter of all of the computer and radio stuff that I've done. And really, without his support and tutelage, I doubt that I would have nearly half the success that I have in my career, or career at all, because of his help. So, thank you very much, Dad, for all that help. As every little boy wants to be like their dad, since he had his ham radio license, I clearly needed to get mine. So, my first taste of ham radio was in 1988. And in 1988 was the very peak of the solar cycle, which means radio communication was really good. And it was easy. And I can remember my dad and I sneaking into his car and using this radio right here on 10 meters to communicate with people all over the world with an antenna attached to his car. And it's hard to imagine this, and some of the mystique has gone, but it was really fascinating to know that I could talk to somebody in Brazil with nothing in between me sitting in a car in a driveway and that person in Brazil. We've kind of lost a little bit of that magic with the internet, where I can just send an email off and it goes to Europe or it goes anywhere in the world in a matter of seconds. We don't think about all the complication and how many nodes it goes through and how exactly does that email message get to that place. But in the magic of radio land, you understand that. You know that I can just get on my radio and communicate. And at the age of 12, this was really, really exciting. So I went through the process of getting my license and learning about how ham radio works. And getting my license involved two things at that time. The first was learning some technical knowledge, learning about radios, learning about electronics, and being able to pass a written exam in multiple choice. The second thing that I had to learn was Morse code at a very slow rate of 5 words per minute. They've done away with the Morse code portion of it now, even though Morse code is as popular, if not more popular than ever. But as you progress through the licensing, the exams get harder and harder, and your knowledge gets larger and larger. So, I can't see the slide on my laptop. So, like I said, in the late 80s, FCC license required learning Morse code. To give you kind of an idea of what that Morse code sounded like, I'm going the wrong way. There should be. Nope. I did have some sound files up here that kind of gave some examples, and I can show you guys them after the presentation's over, so you can kind of hear what some of those sound like. But 5 words per minute is exceptionally slow. You can actually sit and think about what that sound was, write down the letter before the next letter comes, and you hear it. So it was actually pretty easy to pass the 5 word per minute one. As you advance through the exams, you can get all the way up to 20 words per minute, which is almost conversational speed, where you have to learn that language almost as a language in your head. So this is the first radio that I ever had. It is a 1970s Yaesu 2-meter handheld. And it was giant and heavy and used heavy batteries. And it was given to me by my uncle, who, not shockingly, is also a ham radio operator. And this was a radio that I truly adored, because it was the only radio that I had, and it really was my gateway to the technology and speaking on the radios and using it. But the very first thing that I did with my radio was started to hook it up to a computer. And at that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a phenomenon called packet radio. And packet radio was this really wildly new concept where we hooked up computers to each other and had them communicate over wireless. Kind of surprising nowadays that that's pretty much a common thing. But back in the late 80s, this wasn't true. The internet didn't exist. The web didn't exist. There were no web browsers, and none of that was true. At that time, and still to this day, there is an entire Class A network set aside for amateur radio operating. It's called the AmperNet. And that Class A begins with the .44 address. You could see my old call sign here, N8RHV, and this is the IP address that I was assigned. Now, these networks were incredibly slow. They were 1200 baud, and they were half duplex, which means you could only transmit or you could receive. You couldn't do both at the same time. To give you an idea of how slow that this is, I was able to identify a TCP three-way handshake acoustically. I could hear it on the radio and go, oh, somebody's trying to make a TCP connection. Because you could tell how long a SYN packet was and how long an ACK packet was just based upon how it sounded. There was an entire operating system built around using these radios and using these radios in this way, and it was KA9Q NOS. And it was really a network operating system that looks very much modern, like a modern-day Linux. You compiled it. At that time, you booted it off a floppy drive, and you would run this program, and it would give you full TCP/IP capabilities. We had things like ping, and a command called finger, and a chat called TTY-link, and you could send mail. And at 1200 baud half duplex, that's pretty much all you could do. You really couldn't do anything as you would think of as browsing today, but there was also no browser at that time. So we used these to transfer messages, to do email, and to talk to one another. One of the things that I learned, and one of the things that to this day I still use quite a bit in my head, is in NOS, you could hit the F9 key and you could see all the packets going across the radio waves. And you would see them exactly as they would show up in what would be today's Wireshark. And you would see what flags were being set, what data was being set, and what was in the packet. And to me, it was a really useful troubleshooting thing. You could see what was going on the network. You could see who you could hear, who you couldn't hear. just like you would use Wireshark in today's environment. So at the age of 12 and 13, I was really getting into radios and computers and having them connect together. Now, my house was way up here in Utica, Michigan. And where I needed to get was down here at Wayne State, right about where we're standing. Down at Wayne State, there was a computer that had two interfaces, one on the radio, the other connected to this wild thing called the internet, where I could get to any other IP address and get to lots of other universities and different places to explore. The problem is, at 30 miles, that was really hard for me to get to on my little handheld radio from the 70s. So I had to relay through other stations, or route through other stations. This taught me a very valuable lesson, which is how to route in networks. How can I get my packets to go from here to there when I can't communicate directly to that other person? Also a very handy thing when you think about how modern day networks run. So in order to get to the internet, as we know it today, I had to go through another station. I had to go through another location. This bothered me. I didn't really like that. But it's what I had to do. Now the skills that I learned is I learned how to read my first packets. I learned how to, like I said, audibly identify TCP three-way handshake. I also learned how to build routing tables because there were lots of places that I needed to get to, and my little HT with 5 watts couldn't get there. So I had to figure out who I could communicate with and then relay through those stations to get to other places. This is pretty much the foundation of how the internet works. So at 13, I was running around doing those types of things on my computer instead of doing my homework and getting good grades. But like I said, I couldn't get down to this gateway to the internet. That really bothered me. So the next project that I took on is I really wanted to get to communicate directly with that. So I needed to build a bigger antenna. And the antenna that I built from scratch. And this is something that has a very proud history in ham radio, is to take a bunch of junk that people are throwing away and to use it to make something that you can communicate with. Being 13 years old, I had no money. So what I ended up doing was taking a bunch of junk, like a broken hockey stick, some wooden dowels, some leftover wire, and a pop bottle, and I made this antenna, a cubical quad, which is a directional antenna that greatly increases the amount of strength that my little 5-watt radio has. And with this antenna, basically on a broomstick in my front yard, I was able to communicate all the way down to Wayne State from Utica, Michigan, which was pretty cool. This is a culmination of knowledge because I had to figure out how long to make the wires, how to space these different things, and the knowledge that I had from taking that ham radio exam allowed me to build this antenna with the scraps that I found in the garage. I thought that was really cool. I really wish that I took a picture of it back then because now when I went through all of my dad's pictures and my pictures, I figured out we didn't take a lot of pictures of some of these projects because we thought, well, who would want to see a picture of an antenna made out of a hockey stick and a bunch of dowels? But now I really wish that we did have those. And the pop bottle I used to make sure that water didn't get into the wire that went to the HT. So that was a pretty cool experience. And to this day, I still really enjoy building antennas. My dad does a lot of antenna building, and a lot of creative people build antennas because it's a fun part of the hobby. When you build something by hand like that, and you know that your signal, because of what you built, goes across the world or goes further than you've ever gone before, that's a pretty cool feeling. To give you an example of what other kind of antennas and what other people have done, here you can see that somebody took a lawn chair, a scrap lawn chair that somebody was going to throw away, and they built a loop antenna out of it. So one person's trash is another person's antenna. Another example here is this is another type of directional antenna called a Yagi that's built out of a broken tape measure. Pretty easy to measure your element lengths when it's being built out of a tape measure. The skills I learned through all this antenna building is that knowledge is more important than commercial tools. And I don't think anything is more applicable than that than in the information security world, where you can go out and buy a firewall, you can go out and buy all of these magical security tools that are going to block all of the threats coming at you. But in actuality, if you don't have the knowledge, if you don't have the hands-on experience of dealing with those types of things, you're not going to be very successful. You can build things you need and be creative in doing so. And I think that we do that quite a bit in the information security community. Whether we're writing programs by hand, writing scripts to do certain things, always on the cutting edge, you see our people are building things from scratch, usually with open source and free software. Very similar to how you build things out of scraps in the radio world. The other thing that I think about a lot is that hacking is taking something that has a function and making it do something that it was never intended to do. Hacking isn't breaking the law. Hacking isn't breaking into things. It's about taking something and being creative with it. Like, you can take this toy, a slinky, and turn it into an antenna that can talk all the way around the world. You do that by hacking, by taking something that isn't supposed to be an antenna, like a slinky, and turning it into something like an antenna that allows you to do that. So from there, the next thing that I started to do was kit building. As you saw in that first picture, my dad did a lot of soldering. And part of his job at that time was to build stuff, was to create, was to engineer, was to do things in hardware. So, wanting to be like my dad, I took on the soldering iron myself, and I bought kits. And I built a kit that was an entire packet radio, and I started to learn how to solder. And putting these parts together and putting these things together allowed me to learn how to troubleshoot, because I would inevitably get it wrong the first time I did it. And I had to learn how to fix things. I had to learn how to read a schematic and learn how these electronics worked, and maybe make them do things they weren't supposed to do. Nowadays, we would call that hardware hacking, where we get into the electronics themselves and get into a very raw element of taking the devices apart and looking at how those chips work and looking at how they process things and trying to make them do things they weren't designed to do. Now, there's a long history of kits in amateur radio. If you go back into the 50s and 60s, there was a company out of Michigan here called Heathkit, and they built all kinds of equipment. To this day, people still buy and sell this equipment and repair and maintain it because of how well it was designed and how easy it is to repair and take care of. But that has progressed, and there's companies today like Elcraft that build huge radios that are immensely complicated that are also kits that you can buy that take weeks to put together. That radio that you just saw comes in a box that looks like this, and you can see the circuit board has no parts on it. You have to put all of the parts and solder all the parts onto that board with this big manual to tell you how to do it. But at the end of that, you know that you built that radio, and you could probably fix that radio if anything ever broke on it because of that process of building it from scratch. From building it and soldering all those pieces together. As you go through that process, you learn exactly what pieces of that hardware do what in the world of radio. What did I learn through kit building that I applied today? Well, this is really the foundation of all the hardware hacking research that I've worked on. All the work that I've done on insulin pumps, medical devices, different types of radio transmission equipment, that all foundationally goes back to ham radio and me building kits when I was a kid. It's also being able to diagnose and troubleshoot hardware. You can't do that unless you have a good fundamental understanding of electronics and how to do that. But going through that process and that art of troubleshooting, this is where I learned it. I learned it by making mistakes. And those mistakes led me to learn how to do troubleshooting. And that troubleshooting process is the same whether you're doing it in the information security world, whether you're doing it in IT system administration, or you're doing it on a radio kit. I learned how to build things from scratch. That was great and rewarding. I also learned how to read a schematic. So this circuit here, which is a very basic transmitter, I can understand how that works now because of ham radio, the licensing that I learned, and the experience that I had in building kits. One of the things that I love about the hobby of ham radio is that there's a little something for everybody, no matter what your interest is. It's not just about communicating with somebody across the ocean. That might not interest you. If you're a big introvert like I am, it doesn't interest you at all. But there's a lot of things in ham radio that are sports. And one of them is referred to as fox hunting. Fox hunting is the sport of finding the physical location of a transmitter. So I can remember doing this with the club that's based out of the Utica-Shelby area, the Usika Club, which is a club that my dad is very active in. And they would have a fox hunt every year. And you didn't know where the fox was, right, when you start this out. And you would listen for the signal on your HT with an antenna, a directional antenna like that kid is holding. And you would figure out what direction the signal was coming from. And then you would go in that direction. You would say, okay, the direction is coming from the south, so it's got to be going from that way. And if you went a different direction, you could get two lines that crossed, and you knew that transmitter was going to be in that area. And maybe it was in a park. Maybe it was in an empty field. You don't really know where it was. But it was pretty cool to be able to take the basic antenna that you built maybe out of a tape measure, maybe out of some junk that you found in the garage, and be able to find a transmitter with little more than your HT and that antenna. One of the projects that I remember my dad building was a Doppler system that used multiple antennas that could tell you immediately where the signal was coming from. And this is something that was pretty cool. This is kind of a kit that replicated that. Again, we didn't take any pictures of anything that we built for some reason, but this told you, like, this LED would light up if it was coming from the 90-degree compass angle, or if it was coming from the north, it would light up this light. It's a pretty cool piece of technology that you could build by hand. Now, what kind of skills did I learn from doing these types of activities? Well, I think about wireless networks. Wireless networks, there are quite often you need to go and find a transmitter, a wireless node that you might not know where it is, a rogue AP. Being able to track those signals down. Also, one of the things that you learned is how signals get manipulated by physical structures. As fox hunting advances, they do things like get near buildings. And those buildings reflect the radio signals so they look like they're coming from a different direction. So by the sport of fox hunting, you really learn how signals get manipulated by buildings. And all of us have had this trouble when we deal with wireless networks. We can't connect because we're sitting in a room that has maybe too much shielding in it. Or there's kind of a dead spot over here in this building. Well, that's how we learn about those types of things. I also thought it was just a bunch of fun to go out and find those type of transmitters and to go out and explore the area like that. The next sport that ham radio has a lot of involvement in is in contesting. And contesting is the sport of trying to make as many contacts as possible in the shortest period of time and exchanging information accurately. So really this got started because ham radio is used for emergency communication a lot. Before the internet and cell phones, when bad things happened, like tornadoes, weather disasters, flooding, they would rely on ham radio communication to communicate information back and forth in different areas. And to this day, they still do. There are some places that don't have cell phones or the internet that need to have communication in the event of emergencies, like down in the islands during hurricane season. This information exchange might be very simple. It might just be the state and the amount of power you're using. Or it could be complicated. It could be your name and a serial number and the county you're in. But the idea is to exchange that information accurately between two parties. The most popular contests are using voice, which is called sideband, and Morse code, or CW. Now, the rates for these can get as high as 200 contacts per hour. A very skilled operator can exchange that information very quickly and very efficiently and be able to hear multiple stations to be able to do that. I was lucky enough to have opportunities to work at superstations where they had huge antenna arrays that were able to communicate with large amounts of power, where you could do 200 contacts a minute and be very successful at it and be competitive. Here's an example of an antenna farm at a contesting station, and you can see these antennas on lots of different towers on this lot. And these antennas are all directional, pointing in different directions, and have the ability to be rotated to point to different places of the country. Here's another example of these types of antennas. Again, very large towers, lots of aluminum in the air. To give you an idea of the scale of some of these antennas, these are people on the tower working on the antennas. And you can see that these antennas are 30, 40, even longer feet. They're really massive, and they really increase the amount of signal strength and the ability to communicate all over the world. Here's a bank of amplifiers, and in the ham radio community, you're allowed to run up to 1,500 watts, depending on your license level, which, compared to my little 5-watt HT that I had as a kid, is pretty substantial. I have a couple examples up here of what it sounds like to be a contest, but we don't have audio capabilities, and I don't have the ability to play them, so maybe I can show them after the presentation's over. One of my favorite events, and one of the things that my dad and I have always been involved in, is a contest called Field Day. And Field Day is probably the most popular contest in the contesting sport. And the object of Field Day is to start with nothing, an empty field, and in 24 hours set up a station to operate for a period of time, usually 24 hours. And the example here is to make as many contacts as possible, but to do it starting from scratch. And this is a very realistic scenario. Let's say a tornado came through and wiped out a huge amount of area. You have nothing to start with, but you have to build a station to operate and communicate with very quickly. And in this contest, you get extra points for using alternative power, like solar or wind power. And you get more points for doing it in public locations. Now, this is by far the most popular contest due to the low level of effort that you need. You don't need giant antenna farms and those huge antennas. You are on par with everybody else if you go into a park and throw a wire up into the tree. And that makes it really popular and very easy to get into. And like I said, this is a very realistic scenario. You think about different hurricanes, tornadoes, terrorist attacks, places where you have to start with nothing and you have to get a station to communicate on the air as quickly as possible. And here's an example of a picture that I took from a field day. You can see that they just went into a park, a bunch of trees, and stood up some antennas. And you can see they're using fairly good-sized directional antennas, but they're still able to set those up in a short period of time. You could even see the ladder that they're using to support some of their masts. So you have to be creative, right? You have to use what's available to you to get those antennas up in the air and to keep them on the air. Now, one of the things that people don't know is that Morse code is still very, very popular. And most people think, well, that's really weird. We have the internet and we can communicate, and CW or Morse code doesn't seem like something that would continue to be popular. And Jay, didn't you say that they got rid of the Morse code requirements for the license a long time ago? They did. That doesn't stop Morse code from being popular, though. And to this day, it's still the most popular form of communication in ham radio. Now, one of the reasons that it is so popular is because it's so efficient. Here you can see, during a contest, each of these dots represents a different station communicating. And this piece of radio spectrum is very, very, very small. It's actually only about 200 hertz in width. But all of these stations can communicate in that in a very, very, very small amount of space. And to give you an idea, when we communicate over radio and it's on voice, it can be 10 times this size and use up that amount of space. So the efficiency that Morse code has in transmitting effectively and efficiently over radio is quite unique and remarkable. It's also the original digital mode. You're basically sending ones and zeros. It's also referred to in a lot of modern technology as on-off keying. Either you have a signal or you don't. You're making 1 or you're making 0. This is the foundation of a lot of the Internet of Things, to be honest. When I do hardware hacking research and I look at devices, a lot of them are using on-off keying. They're basically sending binary across wireless communication channels, just like a Morse code operator would. One of the things that ham radio is very proud of is their ability to communicate when everything else can't. Even during 9/11, ham radio communication was very, very prevalent and very much needed because cell phone towers were overloaded. You couldn't make phone calls. You couldn't use the internet because that was overloaded as well. But ham radio was still usable. Ham radio operators came out in droves to help communicate during those disasters and to help pass traffic and communicate with emergency responders so that way they could do their job as effectively as possible. And there's a saying that the Amateur Radio Relay League says, when all else fails, amateur radio. And it's a very proud tradition that the amateur radio community and the ham radio community has. So how do we relate these skills to information security and kind of the information security world? Well, the first thing I think about is disaster recovery, right? Every company needs to have a disaster recovery plan. And it only works when it's tested completely and it's done often. It's one of the reasons that field day is every year. It gives ham radio operators the opportunity to get their equipment out, to go out into a field or a park or some place that they choose, and to make sure that their radio works, to make sure that their skills are up to par. Did that antenna break when you took it down last year? Do your batteries still work? Do your solar cells still work? This is no different than do your tape backups work? Right? Does your disaster recovery site still have power? Did you remember to renew your disaster recovery site? These techniques, these thought processes and procedures are the same, whether we're talking about modern corporate networks or ham radio communication. Passing traffic and messages when all forms of communication are down is also important. Is your company ready when a hurricane hits? Anytime I visit a client that's in a hurricane-laden area, I ask them, do you have a form of communication that doesn't involve cell phones? What if cell phone communication is not available? Is usually the response I get. I don't know what I would do. I would wait till the cell phones came back on. Okay, maybe that works for you, but maybe you're a hospital, right? Maybe that's not going to work for you. I also learned that building incredibly complicated radio systems with lots of transmitters at very high power is very complicated. These types of communications aren't just something you take out of the box and they work. You have to practice with them. You have to use them. You have to be competent and experienced in using these systems, just like your disaster recovery platforms. If you don't use them and don't know how to use them, when the time comes that you need to use them, you won't know how. Let's talk about some other areas that ham radio is sunken into. One is space. I haven't done a lot in this area, but I know a lot of people have. Amateur radio operators in the ham radio community have built satellites that are orbiting space that allow you to communicate with little handheld radios and handheld antennas. You can see this little girl is communicating through a satellite, through an HT, through a little handheld radio and that antenna that guy's holding. That's pretty cool, right? You don't get to do that every day, is to build a satellite or to talk to a satellite in space with a radio that you're holding in your hand. It's also very challenging. Having to build these systems, getting involved in the community, the AMSAT program that builds amateur radio satellites. I mean, how do you build something with enough redundancy to make sure that when it's in space, it's going to run if something breaks? Challenging, just like building challenging data centers. How about bouncing stuff off the moon? That could be pretty cool. You can see this huge antenna array here is designed for exactly that. If you could see the moon, you could bounce a signal off it if you have enough power and you have enough antenna. So normally, like, for example, I had struggles getting my 35 miles to get to Wayne State University from Utica. In this case, same frequency. You could use a huge antenna array, and you could talk to Europe from here, using the same frequency of radio. That's pretty neat. To expound on that, that same communication frequency range is used in a lot of Internet of Things, where we might have the range of a couple hundred meters. If you increase the amount of power and you increase the amount of antenna, how far can you go? You can go really far, right? Can I bounce a signal off the moon and turn somebody's insulin pump off in Europe? Probably not. But in some cases, some of these Internet of Things, you can do that. It's pretty amazing. Now we get into some real crazy stuff. How about bouncing things off a meteor trail? Right? If you could bounce it, you can use the same kind of equipment and bounce a signal off the trail of a meteor to talk to a station 2,000 kilometers away. Also a pretty cool thing. Very challenging. One of the more active passions in ham radio is something called QRP, which is the pursuit of communicating at very low power. Generally, this is referred to as less than 5 watts of transmitter power. And you can see that you can build very little radios in Altoids tins, for example, running on 9-volt batteries. Well, how far can you communicate with that little power? Well, the record, as it sits right now, is there are 2 stations that were able to communicate over 1,600 miles between Alaska and Oregon in 1970 with 1 microwatt of power on their transmitter. This is the equivalent of 1.6 billion miles per watt. So you could do some really amazing things with virtually no power. Very, very small power, very small transmitter, even small antennas. One of the things that I recently got into in the last couple months is a digital communication method called WSPR. It's also known as Whisper. And it's very, very slow digital communication that allows very, very narrow transmissions, even narrower than Morse code. To see how good, and this is really used to see how good the propagation is and to see how well your antennas are working. Now, I live in a subdivision that doesn't allow me to put up big antennas. So I put up an antenna in my attic. Basically, just a piece of wire in my attic. Think of it as 25 feet tall, but you can't see it from the outside. Using 1 watt of power, somebody in Australia heard me, 9,510 miles away. That's pretty cool. When I saw that, I was like, wow. That's awesome. I can communicate with a piece of wire in my attic with 1 watt of power, and somebody in Australia can hear me. I was pretty amazed by that, and I have been doing this for quite some time. Like I said previously, Morse code is increasing actually in popularity. There's a part of the community that's very big into the speed of that. So you can go in excess of 200 words per minute in some of these cases where they have competitions to see how fast you can receive and how fast you can kind of translate Morse code in your head. And it's very popular in the contesting world to communicate. Ham radio is also very big in public service. In a lot of events that go on, the example that I have here is kind of a triathlon where they're biking. different events that go on that need more communication than maybe police can offer, or maybe police can't offer that kind of communication. Ham radios will often volunteer to do these things. I know that the USICA, I don't know if they still do the Peach Festival. Sure. Walk America at the Metro Parks, they provide communication for that. They used to provide communication for a festival in Romeo, the Peach Festival, if I remember that correctly. Yeah? Okay. So athletic events, parades, those types of things, the amateur radio community comes out to be able to support those activities and communicate different things for them. An area that has always been popular is collecting these cards. These cards are referred to as QSL cards. QSL is kind of shorthand for verified communication. So if you communicate with a station, they'll send you one of these cards that say, hey, I communicated with you on this day on this frequency. And you can collect these cards and you can get awards. So if you get one from all 50 states, for example, you get a Worked All States award. You can get a WAC award, which is Worked All Continents. They have them for counties, so you can work all the counties in a particular state or in the United States. And it's still very popular. They even have EQSL cards now. So instead of actually mailing them, you can use the internet to exchange these cards and collect them. Do I use Logbook? Yeah, yep. That's the EQSL for the Amateur Radio Relay League. Logbook of the World, I think it's called, right? True. That's very true. But there is still something, and the amateur radio community is very nostalgic at times of having these QSL cards. And the rare ones, you put on your wall, on a board, so that way you can see them. A little harder to do that in the electronic world. So some people still prefer the paper ones, but you're right, it's easier to do a lot of the verification and the awards if you use the electronic version. Another area that's becoming useful in the ham radio community is repurposing old routering equipment. And you can take something like one of these old Linksys routers and put different firmware on it and use it to build a high-speed multimedia radio network or a high-speed mesh network. That, because amateur radio has permission and privileges to use the 2.4 gigahertz band, just like Wi-Fi uses, you can use this type of equipment to build a totally offline mesh network to communicate with. So think of it as a kind of an alternative internet or a networking system. So where am I using a lot of my radio knowledge now? Well, one of the things that I end up doing a lot of research on, like I said, is in the hardware hacking world and in the industrial control and medical world. This is a HackRF, which is a software-defined radio that communicates over a very, very large portion of frequency. It goes from 30 megahertz all the way up to 6 gigahertz. And it can transmit on any frequency in that range. I use this type of equipment to look at the 900 megahertz spectrum, which is the industrial, scientific, but medical band. A lot of devices there, including insulin pumps and pacemakers, defibrillators, neural stimulators, are all transmitting in that band. Now, they're designed to be short distance. So insulin pumps and pacemakers are only really designed to transmit around 3 meters in length, so 9 feet, kind of your wingspan. But as we know, right, we can bounce signals off the moon if we have a big enough antenna and we have enough power. So building antennas to communicate with these types of devices in long distance is something that I've experimented with. And also, because I'm licensed to use higher power, I can use higher power to see how far I can communicate with these devices. There's also the 400 megahertz band, which has a lot of industrial control system. Think water facilities, think gas and electric. And also there's a lot of medical in the 400 megahertz band. One of the other interesting things is RFID chips and near-field communication. There's a portion of that that runs on 13.56 megahertz, which is in the HF band, also very close to what we refer to as the 20-meter band. What's interesting about that is probably the most popular band for long-distance communication. It's not uncommon to be able to take a 5-watt signal on 20 meters and on 14 megahertz and communicate all over the United States, if not further, on a very regular basis. And software-defined radio has become huge in the hardware hacking community. There's lots of different classes on it. A lot of the different hacks that you're seeing revolving around the Internet of Things are using a hack RF or similar software-defined radio technology. As kind of a case study here, the insulin pump research that I published last year in October, I was able to use a software-defined radio platform called the Yardstick 1, which transmitted at 0.01 watts, and I could put that into an amplifier to increase that to 100 watts. And then I could use directional antennas to extend that even further. So to give you an idea, 3 dB is similar to doubling your power. And if you have a 3 dB antenna, that means that this is the equivalent of doubling my power and doubling my listening ability to a different piece of equipment. And you could buy different antennas. Bigger the antenna, usually the more dB gain you get. So you can get a really big antenna like this and have 11 dB of gain. Combining that with an amplifier that gives you 10-fold power, you can communicate with things that really aren't designed to be communicated with over long distances, like medical equipment. And all the work that I've done on my insulin pump research and other types of research have always revolved around software-defined radio and using that ham radio knowledge and experience. So that's really all I have for today. I hope that you guys enjoyed the presentation. There's actually going to be ham radio licensing exams shortly after this in a room down there, so you can actually look and see what some of those tests look like and talk to some people that know a lot more about ham radio. And give you an idea of what kind of other things that you can experience. You really can pass the exam with not that much studying. I mean, I did it at 12, and I didn't think it was all that difficult, and I'm sure that pretty much everybody in this room could probably study for a couple weeks and be able to take that test. It's really a fulfilling hobby. You get to meet a lot of common-minded people, very similar to the information security community, some very unique people. But some very smart people as well that allow you to kind of expand your field of knowledge and to learn about these types of technologies and equipment. So with that, I thank you.